This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Roots and All, where my guest is Dr. Rebecca Beattie. Rebecca has just released a book called The Wheel of the Year, which is a look at what is happening in nature and in ourselves as the seasons move from one to the other. She suggests tools and rituals to rediscover and appreciate each seasonal festival, giving you a chance to pause, reflect, and connect you to the wheel of your own life. As this is the last episode of 2022, and the winter solstice is just 2 days away, I thought this would be a perfect way to wrap up the year, and to encourage you to take the time to appreciate, well, time, as it passes, and as things shift from one state of being to another. Christmas can be a frenetic time, so I hope you can take half an hour out of your schedule to sit down and listen to Rebecca, and to contemplate your place in the Wheel of the Year. Rebecca starts by explaining the concept behind her book.
The Wheel of the Year is a series of festivals that were based on, it's a mixture of different sources that come into the sort of reimagining of it, if you like. So it's a modern iteration of something that's much, much older. And it was designed by two men. There are various different versions of the creation myth, if you like, for the Wheel of the Year, but the version I was taught was that it was designed by two men in sometime around the 1940s to 1950s to that kind of period, and it's following the repeal of the Witchcraft Act that happened in 1951, and we had at that point the emergence of various different modern pagan groups that started to emerge at that time. So we had the modern pagan druids started to be a thing that were brought about by a man called Ross Nicholson. And then we had also the emergence of modern pagan witchcraft, which happened about a decade before that, which was started by, amongst other people, but the main person that brought that about was Gerald Gardner. And both men were friends. They both used to meet at Stonehenge to celebrate the solstices and got along very well. And they started to share ideas about what the witches were doing and what the pagan druids were doing. And so we get this merging of different festivals, that some of which are ancient, some of them are old Celtic festivals that date back centuries, and some of them are kind of a little bit more modern in their outlook. So we end up with this Wheel of the Year, which is basically 8 festivals that goes over the year, and they follow nature in its emergence through that time. So we sort of start with the midwinter solstice at Yule in December, and then we have Imbolc in February, spring equinox in March, Beltane in April, midsummer in June, Lammas in August, autumn equinox in September, and then Samhain or Halloween in October. And each one of those festivals picks out what's happening in nature, particularly in the British Isles, because that's where the emergence happened. We sort of start looking at what's happening in nature at that time. So we pick out themes. For example, at spring equinox, we're thinking about the emergence of spring flowers, and at Lammas, it's the harvests that are happening of the corn in the cornfields. So it gives us this moment every 6 weeks of pausing whatever we're doing in our modern, crazy, mostly urban lives. And we pause and we sort of just stop and take check of what's happening in nature at that time.
That's a really good time frame, I think. It feels like for me, it's not that regular that it becomes onerous, and it's not that far apart that you're always kind of connected from one time to another. So I think this is probably quite a complicated question to ask, and you did allude to the kind of Celtic traditions and things, but do the origins of the events and the customs that you find at these different times come from lots of different sources? Can you trace them back even?
Yes, some of the festivals are traced back. So if we take Samhain as an example, that's an ancient Celtic festival that's been celebrated in, Ireland and Scotland and the Isle of Man and Wales over centuries and centuries. It's a really old festival. And then we have other festivals. So if we take Midwinter as an example, there's evidence of people celebrating Midwinter back to prehistory, if you like. We have evidence of there having been festivals celebrated at Stonehenge, as an example. They've got archaeological evidence of there being celebrations and feasts that happen at the midwinter point throughout prehistory, really. So this doesn't just stay in the United Kingdom. You can see evidence across the globe. So, for example, if you travel to Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt and go down or up the Nile Delta, as it were, and sort of go into the deepest sort of part of Egypt, we go to Abu Simbel, and there's a temple complex there that was created by Ramesses the Great, where there's a doorway that opens up in the front of the temple, which at the moment of the sunrise at midwinter, the sun comes up, shines straight down this little tiny doorway in comparison to the size of the temple, and down through to the Holy of Holies that's down a kind of corridor in the temple, and it shines on that sacred place. And there are sites in the British Isles as well where this takes place, where you have a tiny little doorway that's aligned to the rising sun at the midwinter point, that things have been celebrated, and we can see that they have, as long as humans have existed, and as long as we've had this need to shine some light in our darkest times of the year. We all have this point, don't we, in winter, where we're sort of, often it's our death rates increase and our depression rates increase, and we need to find that little bit of hope and sacredness that we rely on to sort of bolster our spirits, really. So some of the festivals are ancient, some of them are, a little bit more modern in outlook, but, quite a few of them are prehistoric festivals that humans have always had a need for. So really what Ross and Gerald were doing was tapping into something that was a very modern creation, but inspired by ancient origins and ancient human needs to celebrate things.
Actually, reading the book, it did raise in my mind that obviously a lot of us are living in quite secular societies.
Yes.
I wondered if you think we're beginning to realise the importance of connecting back to a framework that makes sense of our time and our place in the world.
Definitely. I think that we've become disconnected, haven't we? I think with the rise of the need to have scientific evidence for things, and for us to feel a sense of control, I think that humans have got this idea that we're in control of our own lives and our own world. And we've got further and further away from the sacred. So as through our history, we've become more secular, things have become disconnected from that sense of being sacred. And I think if you look at environmental issues, it's evident there, isn't it, that we have, as a human race, very little regard for certain aspects of nature. We feel that we're superior to our non-human animal companions. We think that we're the top of the food chain and that everything is explainable and curable and in our control. And I think that what's interesting is we're not the first generation to realise that we have to return to that sacred connection. One of the things that I discovered through my own research for my PhD, I was researching a nature writer called Mary Webb, who lived in the 1920s. And at the point of the 1930s onwards, we had this period where post 2 world wars, we had a massive global pandemic of the Spanish flu. We had, economic collapse in all parts of the globe. And at that point, humans decided that they needed to reconnect to nature. So in my grandparents' generation, there were posters everywhere suggesting that you should spend your leisure time in the counties, and go by train, travel by car to the countryside. And we had this thing that I refer to as the countryside revival, because it's a reconnecting to nature, and it's a sense of needing to look to nature for healing, for spiritual connection, for inspiration. And so fast forward a century, we're doing something now that our grandparents' generation also did 100 years ago. So it's not new, but it's new to us. And I think that what's lovely about, obviously COVID pandemic has been a terrible, terrible thing. And yet it's encouraging people to turn back to nature. They're starting to see that there is something there that can fulfill them.
You, in a way, are preaching to the converted a little bit.
Absolutely.
Roots and All podcast, where people are really into the environment and gardening.
Yeah.
Reading the book, I thought of actually probably a lot of people who listening at the moment already are kind of connected to the wheel.
Yes.
To a degree. Do we as gardeners have an advantage in that sense, and also how can we enhance that connection?
I think you've definitely got an advantage. So one of the things I noticed before I wrote the book, for about 6 years or so before that, I've been teaching Wheel of the Year in a small bookshop in Bloomsbury in London. And one of the things that I always ask my students when we're looking at each Wheel of the Year festival in turn is, what is visible in nature at this time? What do you see happening in nature? And I started to have this experience where in the early days of the classes, we were very urban and living in this massive metropolis, and people weren't used to seeing nature. They weren't used to looking for it. They would sort of say, well, we live in the city. What's this got to do with us? But as a gardener, you're there already. You're observing the small signs. You're paying really close attention to what's happening in the environment around you. So you've already got that sense of what's happening. You've already got that, minutiae of what's in season, what's in flower, what's in leaf at any time. And even in our deepest, darkest part of winter, we've got signs of life that are continuing in the garden. There are certain tasks that you reserve for doing in winter, because that's the point that nature is resting, and we have to sort of take advantage of doing those tasks at that point. And I think that what's happening in nature is also reflected in what's happening for us as a part of nature. We aren't divorced from it. We are, as human creatures, we're part of what's going on in the natural world. And it often reflects the cycles that we go through as well. So in winter, we might find that we need to rest more, or, we need to sort of recharge our own batteries a little bit and allow ourselves to do those tasks that get you ready for the spring coming.
Actually, that has touched upon something, and this is going a little bit off piste, but when I was reading the book, I kind of thought, well, birds breed at this particular time.
Yeah.
These obviously follow this pattern of life, birth, death, renewal. And the only element in the natural world that doesn't seem to follow that pattern is human birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is kind of not a question that I suppose you have an answer to, but does that make us a little bit removed? What happens?
Yeah, I mean, our own cycles, we've always seen ourselves as almost separate, haven't we, from the natural world? And yet our death rates increase in winter, just like every other species. I think birth rates are probably year round, although there would be probably surges at certain times. So, for example, with the festival Beltane, there is a phenomenon known as Beltane babies, who are born 9 months after the Beltane festival, which was all about reconnecting to our sense of joy and sexual freedom and love. And that's the kind of running theme of that particular festival. And it was quite common for 9 months later for there to be a surge in births. So I guess in the modern world, it would be interesting to know if there are times of year that there are surges. I know in my family, there's an awful lot of November birthdays that sort of crop up that probably correspond to something happening in our own calendar. I'd have to count backwards, so that would be to sort of February time, wouldn't it? Yeah, I think as humans, we have got to the point where we think we're not connected to nature, and yet we're a lot more connected than we realise.
Yeah, you've just made me realise I'm a Beltane baby.
Yeah. Might not have been conscious on the part of your parents, but who knows?
That's really interesting though, because your book, obviously it kind of talks about the history and all the things that come along, but it also is instructional to a degree.
Yes.
And you do kind of details on things that people can be doing at appropriate times during the year. And I guess this question is twofold. One is, how did you intend people to use the book? Do you want them to kind of dip back into it at the right times of the year? And also, do people need much in the way of almost supplies or equipment to be celebrating these times of the year?
How to use the book is a really good question. I mean, I've started with December. The first festival that I've picked out is December, and I think I'd always intended that with the Wheel of the Year, we have this need for perfection as humans, don't we? Which can often be the kiss of death for anything. That when we're seeking perfection, we kind of get hung up on stuff and think, oh no, I'm a terrible person because I've missed this particular festival. I intended the book that is one that you can dip in and out of, that wherever you pick it up, at whatever point of the year that you're in, you can more or less jump into that latest festival and just start where you are. I think in terms of, you can read it cover to cover as well. There's nothing wrong with that approach. But in terms of, do you need much? I've kind of tried to keep it as simple as possible in terms of supplies. So as a hedge witch, I tend to work a lot with herbs and with essential oils. So I've got a very well-stocked kitchen cupboard, which is not necessarily everybody's bag. But I think that these days we have got easier access to supplies than we might have had 20 years ago. If you've got access to the internet, you can get things posted to you that you might need, like particular herbs or essential oils. If you're a gardener and you grow your own, then I'm one of these people that cannot follow a recipe for love nor money. So if I ever have a recipe that I'm following to make something, I'm always substituting ingredients as I go. What I've tried to do is give people a sense for each festival of themes in terms of planetary attributes, which gives us colours. So, for instance, you might be celebrating the midwinter point and look at the recipe for a particular thing in the book and think, oh gosh, I haven't got any orange essential oil, but you might have access to oranges because they're in season at that time. Or you might have access to other plants or dried flowers or herbs that are yellow. For each of the rituals, I'm encouraging people to go out in nature before they actually do any of the rituals. I'm encouraging people to think about what poems they know that correspond to a particular theme, and suggesting that, you don't have to buy lots of expensive stuff. We can go with, as long as we're doing it ecologically, gathering a bit from our own garden or gathering from a natural space that's around you, as long as you're leaving enough there for nature. We don't necessarily have to have complicated 23 meters of a particular color of ribbon, or that's the kind of thing that I used to find in spell books when I was starting out, that you'd have these really incredibly intricate lists of ingredients that you need to look for. And I've tried to kind of keep this as minimalist as I can. My lens on life is always working with herbs and essential oils and nature, because that's the kind of person I am. So I've kind of tried to encourage that, but everyone has their own way, don't they? Everyone has the level of comfort that they have. So some of the tasks are just journaling with a notebook, and some things are asking you to go out and observe a tree or go out and have a walk in nature.
Thinking about the weather.
Yes.
We've had some really weird seasons in the past.
We have.
Does that affect, or should it affect, how we celebrate these different times of the year?
I mean, if you think about it, one of the changes we've had since global pandemic is that we also have connected with each other across much wider distances. One of the things that I've noticed is that when I started having conversations with students about what's in season, I would have people saying it's the orange harvest in Spain right now, or, there's forest fire season happening in California. So I think it's really important that wherever you are, what you're doing is connecting to the nature that's around you, rather than through the lens of what's near me because I'm writing the book. So, we might find that, for instance, at Beltane, that I talk about hawthorn blossom. Well, if you don't have hawthorn trees, that's not going to mean much, but you will have something that's local to you that is in blossom at that time or is in leaf. Similarly, in the winter, in the British Isles, we're obviously in winter in December. If you're living in Australia, you're going into your summertime at that point and actually celebrating midsummer, not midwinter. So there are variations in how you can celebrate these festivals. And if you're living in Australia, it doesn't make sense to be celebrating Yule at the point where it's actually your summer. So I think it's really important to be observant of what's happening for you locally, what's happening in nature where you are. So I do try and suggest that just because I'm describing a certain thing a certain way, it might not be the best description of what's happening where you are.
That makes total sense. This episode is going out near to the winter solstice. We had somebody who I know who I suggested they took part in an online course, and they got an email through and it mentioned spells. And he said to me, I got this email and it says spells and I'm out. I can't cope with it.
It's not for me.
Yeah. Some people will just see that and go, oh, like you say, not for me. But some people are kind of receptive and they're open to certain things. If someone was dipping their toe in the water, is there anything that you could recommend that they just try with to see how it goes?
Absolutely. I mean, the use of ritual language as well in the book's been written for a multicultural, multi-faith audience. So you'll note that I've got discussions that I've had with people that are of completely different spiritual backgrounds. Sometimes it's discussions I've had with people who are completely secular. It's not meant to be a preachy, this is the only way to do it. And I think that a spell is really, in my model of the world, it's just an active goal. We're used to doing SMART goals at work, and they've worked very similarly to spells, that this is a thing that you want to bring about, whether you call it a spell or you call it a goal or you call it just an aim for something. It doesn't really matter. It's what language is comfortable for you. So some of the recipes that I've used, I'm looking at a recipe at the moment. It's just in front of me from the Midwinter chapter, which is talking about a solar healing oil. You can delete the word healing if you want to, but the sun is associated with healing for us and has been for millennia. It's not, a new thing because of witchcraft. We always look at the sun as being a healing force, don't we, in our lives, that we go and sit on a beach and sort of think that that's a restful way of recharging your batteries. And the recipe for the solar healing oil that I've written for the Midwinter Festival is really just to tap into that kind of archetypal view that we have of all things solar as being healing. It's got ingredients in it that are seen as being sacred to the sun, but they're associated with the sun, really. That's what that means. So it's got things like essential oil, orange essential oil in it, because these are the scents that when we see an orange or we smell an orange, you get that kind of as above, so below feeling of, it reminds us of the sun. So that's really what we're doing, is using ingredients that remind us of a particular thing. and we're using that to evoke something. So there's a recipe there for a sun oil, if you like, that uses a bit of orange essential oil, some sunflower oil. Again, sunflowers, you look at them, you think of the sun. You know, there are ways we use the plants and the herbs to it's just reminding our unconscious minds of what's there for us in that particular energy. I'm not sure if I've answered the question there, so correct me if I haven't.
No, you absolutely have. I think it's just giving people that link between consciously thinking about what they do.
Yeah.
I think a lot of gardeners would do it subconsciously anyway. So
absolutely.
How to be, I guess, mindful while they're doing do a lot.
Yeah. And I guess some of it is just about doing things mindfully. I mean, you've used the magic word there, haven't you? That we often do things automatically without thinking about why or for what purpose. And I think following the Wheel of the Year is just about mindfully noticing the small details that people often walk past every day or dismiss because, you know, they see it all the time and they don't think it's special. And really what I think is different about this approach is that I'm inviting you to just notice what you notice on a daily basis.
Thank you very much to Rebecca. I love the ideas in her book, and I try really hard to take time out to appreciate the changing seasons and the small things. It doesn't come easy to me, so I hope you're better at it than I am. And although the timing seemed to work out, I spoke to my mum, who says the dear old NHS got their dates wrong, and though I thought I might be a Beltane baby, she reckons I wasn't, and she should know. I'd also like to say thank you to you for listening. And thank you for listening this year. I really appreciate that in a busy world you take the time to listen to Roots and All. And thank you to everyone who takes the time to support the podcast by emailing, commenting and sharing the content. And thank you so much to the Patreon subscribers, without whom the podcast most definitely would not happen. If you like Roots and All, of course I'd love you to support my work on Patreon. The money coming in each month from Patreon pays for the podcast to be edited and goes some way towards paying for the website. It doesn't cover my time, but the podcast has always been a labour of love for me, and it remains ad-free and independent, which is how I intend for it to stay. If you do find the content useful, perhaps you would consider becoming a patron or making a one-off donation on my GoFundMe page. If money is an issue, I get that. Sharing the podcast with a friend or on social media and leaving a rating and review on your podcast app is the next best thing, and it helps me grow the audience. The podcast started really small, and it now features at the top of the charts each week, which is really quite incredible for a one-person band with no backup, and you make that happen by listening as much as you do. So we've all collectively made Roots and All a player amongst some media giants, and long may it continue. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and New Year, and I'll see you again in mid-January. And to play us out with his last bug of the week of 2022 is the fabulous Dr. Ian Bedford.
Each year, there's around 60 different butterfly species that could be seen in Britain. And amongst these are 7 small, fast-flying species that we call the blues, because of their distinctive cerulean wing colours. Britain's blues all belong to a large family of butterflies called the Lycaenidae, which comprises of around 6,000 species worldwide. A family from which many members have evolved Myrmecophilous associations, which means they interact with ants. Ants who'll protect their caterpillars from predators and often care for them inside their nests. But why might ants do this? Well, even after centuries of study, it remains an enigma as to who's manipulating who, or whether it's just a true symbiotic partnership. Since the Lycaenidae caterpillars seem able to stimulate the ants' caring behaviour using vibrational signals, whilst the ants passively harvest sugary secretions from the caterpillar's body. And as for Britain's blue butterflies, they all appear to have Myrmecophilous associations too, with some more blatant than others. But possibly the most fascinating relates to the life and times of our large blue butterfly. First recorded as a British species 200 years ago, the large blue had always remained rare, surviving only in small pockets on grazed heathland across the southwest of England. But during the 20th century, their populations started to decline until eventually in 1979, Britain's large blue was declared extinct. Despite a huge effort to avert this tragic loss, the cause of this butterfly's demise had never been identified, and it remained a mystery until Professor Jeremy Thomas, a student butterfly ecologist at the time, discovered the answer during his research on Dartmoor. He found that the large blue had evolved a unique association with just one species of red ant that collected its young caterpillars from wild thyme, then kept them in their nests, where they fed them on the ant's larvae. However, the ants' nests could only survive in locations where heathland grass was maintained short by grazing animals. And so during the post-war years, when myxomatosis decimated the wild rabbit populations, the heathland grass grew taller, the ants' nests died out, and the large blue became extinct. Unfortunately, this discovery came too late to save the last of Britain's large blue butterflies. But by understanding why it had happened, enabled the re-establishment of large blues using Scandinavian stock to sites across the southwest of England, creating what is now thought to be the largest populations of large blue butterflies to be found anywhere in the world.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.